Today, Now We're Talking TV, is speaking with Professor George-Yarrow, the Director of the Regulatory Policy Institute, Oxford. Professor Yarrow has provided a submission to the government's National Broadband Network Regulatory Review, outlining his views on the regulatory policy changes needed to encourage investment in next-generation networks. Professor Yarrow, there are still some sceptics who question the need for next-generation telecommunication networks, or that governments should be involved in funding them. What would you say to them?
Well, I think the need, if you want to put it that way, will be determined by demand ultimately. So it's a question of assessing what demand will be, and I think that's rather uncertain. I think it is true that there is considerable uncertainty about how much people will be willing to pay for the services. In regard to the role of government, my understanding is that the interest of the Australian government is largely in relation to ensuring a high penetration geographically of any new network, so that it reaches not just the dense urban areas, but much less dense rural areas. And that has been a traditional concern of governments in these sectors for many years. The big issue is how to do it. How to get that coverage in an efficient way.
What's the biggest problem for policymakers in attracting investment in next generation networks like Australia's national broadband network?
Well, again, let me stress the demand uncertainty. So there is a commercial factor at work, which is whoever is putting money into these networks will have to do some rather careful calculations as to what the demand will actually be, and it's far from clear. But given that, if you've gone through that obstacle and determined that it is commercially worth doing, the biggest issue then is probably creating the right regulatory environment, and in particular avoiding regulatory uncertainty, which can create a situation in which something which is justified commercially might prevent it actually happening because of the regulatory obstacles or regulatory risks that can be introduced through policy.
What are the main risks around investment? Is it certainty of return?
It's not that it affects certainty of return. What regulation may do, if there is too much of a focus on what in economics would be referred to as the static issues, i.e. if there's too much focus on making sure that prices reflect costs, you can get a situation where if demand turns out to be high for the network, then the commercial returns are chopped off at the top. They're capped by the regulation. But at the same time, if it turns out that the investment produces less demand, less revenue than was expected, there's no compensating mechanism on the downside. So that an investor looking at the prospect will look at something which is rather truncated on the upside, but still nevertheless has the downside. And in those circumstances, what might be a reasonable commercial investment, if the upside was available as well, becomes unattractive, and that may stop the investment.
What sort of things could be done to compensate?
Well, the way in which regulators, I think, are tending to handle this problem, and it doesn't just occur in telecoms, it's happening in energy as well, where you've got big long-term new investment projects to do with climate change policy, for example. One of the developments, and you see this in the UK, is to go for much longer review periods, so that instead of regulators setting prices and then resetting them after a few years, what happens is there is an agreement, whatever it is, but over a much longer duration, say 20 years in the case of some of the investments now being made in the North Sea in relation to new transmission in electricity. So that's one way. The other, of course, is if you have a situation where it's not clear that there will be profits anyway on a big new investment, it does raise the question of whether you want to regulate at all. And deregulation is an alternative, and that in the UK is a recommendation or a policy which has been recommended by the Civil Aviation Authority in relation to Stansted Airport, where there is an issue about a big investment programme, and the Civil Aviation Authority has looked at the issue, decided that regulation is distorting the investment choice, and recommended to the government deregulation, just straightforward removal of the price cap. The UK government rejected that advice, but you will see there that that's an alternative way of approaching some of the problems depending on particular context.
British Telecom's separation model is often held up as an example for Australia to follow. Should we follow in their footsteps, and would that help encourage investment in NBN?
Well, I think every case has to be looked at in its own context. So I certainly wouldn't recommend translating anything from any other jurisdiction, in fact, not just BT, but anywhere, automatically into Australia, because there'll be differences, and policy rightly should reflect and be sensitive to those differences. So that, for example, the BT model is certainly not being rolled out across Europe. Other people take a different view of the issues. I think what can be said is that it's highly unlikely that particular model would be favourable to new investment. It's not really, in infrastructure anyway, it's not really addressed at that issue. And the more general arguments that you will find in the UK, I think, tend to lean towards it having a slightly negative effect. I don't think it's very large on investment. For a number of reasons. It focuses the company a bit more just on the infrastructure element, and therefore managers might be take less account of benefits even to the same company which occur outside of the sort of the division, the relevant part of the business that handles the relevant infrastructure. But more importantly, of course, it's a fairly big thing to reorganise in that way, so it has its own costs. And one of those costs is the diversion of managerial effort and concentration onto an internal organisational task, and away from other things that the managers might be concentrating on, like putting in new investment and finding ways to improve the service offered to shareholders. So inevitably, whenever you go through a major change like that, there will be some distraction element that occurs. And I think there is some of that in the UK, although I don't think the effects are very large. But I think you can conclude that there's nothing in that which is positive for investment, and I know of no evidence that would suggest that.